There comes a moment when you begin to notice something subtle but undeniable. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel strangely draining. Topics that used to excite you no longer hold your attention. Familiar environments feel slightly off, as if you're standing in a place you know well but seeing it through different eyes. You don't feel broken, and you're not in crisis. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet something inside you has shifted. Your emotional reactions change without warning. You respond more slowly, more quietly, sometimes not at all. What once felt natural now requires effort, and what once felt necessary now feels optional. This can be confusing because there is no clear story to explain it. No obvious wound, no single event you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. It's not sadness in the usual sense, and it's not detachment either. It's simply a growing sense that you no longer fit as easily into spaces, roles, or dynamics that once felt like home. You listen to people speak and notice a gap not between you and them, but between who you are now and who you used to be when these conversations made sense. You might even try to push past it, to respond the way you always have, only to feel an unexpected fatigue afterward. This is not a signal that something is wrong with you. It's not a failure of connection or a loss of empathy. It's the quiet awareness that your inner landscape has changed before your mind has had time to catch up. You haven't lost yourself. You are noticing yourself more honestly, and that honesty can feel unfamiliar at first, even unsettling, because it removes the automatic patterns you once relied on. Nothing here needs to be fixed or explained away. This moment isn't asking you to label it as pain, growth, or awakening. It's simply asking you to notice, to acknowledge, without judgment, that something in you has moved, that the version of you who fit everywhere no longer exists in the same way, and that this shift didn't arrive loudly, it arrived quietly, as most real internal changes do. If this resonates with you, take a moment to support this space. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the most meaningful shifts begin when we realize we're not the only ones who feel this quiet change happening inside. When this shift begins, fear often follows quietly behind it. The mind rushes in to explain what the body and emotions can't yet name. You start telling yourself that you've become strange, distant, or cold. You wonder if something is wrong with you, if you've lost an essential part of your personality, or if you're slowly disconnecting from others in a way you don't fully understand. Questions arise not from clarity, but from uncertainty. Why do people feel harder to relate to, and why do they seem not to understand you anymore? T's fear isn't irrational, and it doesn't mean you're it appears, because the old internal map you used to navigate the world no longer works the way it used to. The identity that once guided your reactions, choices, and sense of belonging is losing its reference points. When that happens, the mind interprets the unfamiliar as danger. It looks for faults, diagnoses, and explanations, because it would rather believe something is wrong than sit with not knowing who it is becoming. Feeling misunderstood at this stage doesn't mean you've changed for the worse. It means you're no longer operating from patterns that made you predictable and easy to read. The fear comes from standing between versions of yourself, where the old no longer fits and the new hasn't fully formed yet. But what if this sense of being different is not a problem to solve at all? What if it's not a sign of disconnection, but the first quiet signal that something inside you is expanding? Instead of asking what went wrong, consider a different question. What if your internal system is reorganizing itself before you can consciously understand it? The discomfort you feel may not be evidence of loss, but of growth happening beneath the surface. Seen through the lens of Mary Ainsworth, this shift takes on a different meaning. Ainsworth's work revealed that our emotional patterns are shaped by safety, attunement, and the need to adapt in order to stay connected. When those patterns begin to change, it doesn't mean attachment has failed. It often means the system no longer needs to cling, perform, or overadjust to maintain bonds. Feeling different can be the earliest sign that your nervous system is learning a new way to relate. This turning point invites you to pause before judging yourself. Perhaps you're not becoming distant, but more internally anchored, not less connected, but less dependent on external validation. When the old ways of relating stop working, it can feel unsettling, but that disruption may be exactly how expansion announces itself quietly, without certainty, asking only that you stay open long enough to recognize it. Internal expansion rarely arrives with insight or certainty. It doesn't announce itself with clear thoughts or reassuring explanations. It begins with a sense of misalignment, a quiet feeling that something no longer fits the way it used to. Your emotional system shifts first, adjusting beneath conscious awareness, while the mind struggles to keep up. This is why the experience feels confusing rather than enlightening at the beginning. You feel different long before you can explain why. The nervous system often recognizes change before language exists to describe it. Emotional responses soften, sharpen, or withdraw without a clear reason. What once triggered automatic reactions now pass us without impact, while new sensitivities emerge unexpectedly. The mind searches for meaning, but there are no words yet. This gap between feeling and understanding creates the impression that something is wrong, when in reality, something is reorganizing. Expansion doesn't start with answers. It starts with instability. The old internal structure loosens before a new one forms. Because we're taught to trust clarity, we tend to distrust this phase, yet this is precisely how deeper shifts unfold. The difference you sense is not evidence of confusion, but proof that your inner system is evolving ahead of your conscious narrative. The language will come later. For now, the change speaks through sensation, not explanation. This phase often feels like a loss of personality, but that interpretation misses what is really happening. You didn't suddenly become someone else. You didn't lose warmth, depth, or interest in others. What changed is that you stopped unconsciously shaping your behavior to preserve connections that required constant self. The version of you that knew how to adapt, appease, or perform for emotional safety is no longer running the system. For a long time, what felt like who you are may have been a set of learned responses designed to maintain closeness. You knew when to speak, when to soften, when to suppress your reactions in order to keep harmony. That wasn't false, it was adaptive. But when your internal sense of safety begins to grow, those same behaviors start to feel unnatural, even uncomfortable. What once kept you connected now feels misaligned. This is why interactions can suddenly feel scripted or draining. The old patterns still exist, but they no longer feel honest. You're not rejecting others. You're rejecting the need to regulate yourself to be accepted. The discomfort comes from recognizing that what once felt like authenticity was partly survival. As that survival mode fades, what remains may feel unfamiliar, but it is closer to who you actually are. Think of this change like wearing clothes that once fit perfectly, but no longer do. Nothing is wrong with the fabric, and nothing is wrong with your body. The discomfort comes from growth. What once felt natural now feels tight, restrictive, and awkward. Not because it was bad, but because you be outgrown Italiano. Trying to force yourself back into it only makes you more aware of how much you've changed. Or imagine living for years in a house that suited you well, until one day you realize you can barely move inside it anymore. The ceilings feel low, the rooms feel narrow, and everything feels cramped. The house didn't shrink. You expanded. Yet if you don't recognize that growth, you might assume the problem is you, rather than the space you're trying to inhabit. The same applies emotionally. You may be speaking the same emotional language you always have, using familiar responses and patterns, but they no longer express what you feel. The language hasn't become wrong. It's simply too limited for who you're becoming. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign of failure or dysfunction. It's the friction that appears when expansion meets an old structure that can no longer contain it. As this internal shift continues, the old relational system begins to collapse quietly. Conversations that once felt engaging now leave you empty, as if nothing meaningful was exchanged. You notice repetitive dynamics that used to feel normal now seem shallow or mechanical. It's not that the people involved have changed for the worse, but that the depth you once supplied to these interactions is no longer coming from the same place. What used to nourish you emotionally no longer does. Some people may react negatively to this change. They might sense your difference before you name it yourself. You speak less, explain less, and no longer fill emotional gaps the way you once did. This can feel threatening to those who unconsciously relied on your old role. The discomfort they express isn't necessarily hostility. It's confusion. The system they knew depended on your previous way of showing up. The collapse isn't an act of rejection. It's the natural outcome of internal reorganization. When one part of a relational pattern changes, the entire structure is affected. What no longer works isn't a failure of connection, but a sign that the relationship was built around a version of you that can no longer be sustained. What you're experiencing now needs to be named correctly, because misnaming it creates unnecessary fear. This is not isolation, even if you feel more withdrawn than before. It is not coldness, even if your emotional responses have become more selective. And it is not rejection, even if some connections naturally loosen. Those labels imply a closing of the heart, but what is happening is a recalibration of how and where your energy flows. This stage is best understood as an intermediate phase of internal reorganization. The old structure has loosened, but the new one has not fully formed. You're standing in between, without a clear identity to lean on. That uncertainty can feel uncomfortable because the mind wants definitions and certainty. Yet, the absence of a clear self-image is part of the process, not a mistake. At this point, you may not be able to say who you are becoming, but you can clearly sense who you can no longer be. The roles, reactions, and emotional postures that once felt necessary now feel unsustainable. This is an emptiness in a negative sense. It's a transitional space where clarity hasn't arrived yet, but truth already has. There is a gentle warning that needs to be heard during this phase. Trying to go back to normal will only drain you. When you attempt to recreate old versions of yourself to make others comfortable, the effort feels heavy because it goes against your current internal state. What once happened naturally now requires constant self-monitoring, and that tension slowly turns into exhaustion. Forcing emotional fit creates anxiety as well. You may notice yourself rehearsing reactions, adjusting your tone, or offering explanations you don't fully believe, just to maintain familiarity. These restore connection. It weakens your sense of stability. The more you try to perform the old role, the more disconnected you feel from yourself. And when you over-explain your change, you unintentionally dilute it. Expansion doesn't need justification to be real. This phase asks for something different. Inward listening instead of outward performance. Your system is communicating through discomfort, fatigue, and silence. Honoring those signals is not selfish. It's stabilizing. Growth doesn't require convincing others or maintaining appearances. It requires space, patience, and the willingness to let your inner state lead before your social identity catches up. As this reorganization settles, something subtle begins to emerge. You may notice that your emotional world becomes more selective, not closed, but intentional. You no longer feel compelled to engage in every exchange or maintain every connection. Silence starts to feel less awkward and more supportive, as if it gives your system room to breathe rather than something that needs to be filled. This quiet isn't emptiness, it's alignment. Along with this comes a reduced need for external validation. You still care, but you're no longer driven by the urgency to be seen, understood, or approved of in the same way. The pressure to explain yourself softens. Instead of scanning others for reassurance, your attention turns inward, checking whether something feels stable and true before engaging. New forms of connection also appear. They tend to be fewer, slower, and more conscious. These bonds don't rely on emotional intensity or constant affirmation. They are built on presence, safety, and mutual respect for internal boundaries. This isn't a personal achievement or a moral upgrade. It's regulation. Your system is learning how to relate without overstimulation, without self-abandonment, and without needing to prove anything to remain connected. At this point, a common fear tends to surface. The worry that this change will lead to loneliness. You might ask yourself whether becoming more selective, quieter, and less reactive will eventually leave you alone. This fear makes sense, because for a long time connection may have been maintained through effort, availability, and emotional flexibility. When those strategies fall away, it can feel as if relationships themselves are at risk. But expansion does not remove people from your life. It removes the emotional dependencies that once held certain connections together. What fades are the bonds that required you to overextend, over-explain, or abandon your internal signals to feel close. These dynamics were not rooted in safety, but in adaptation. As your sense of internal security grows, those patterns no longer function. What remains is not isolation, but clarity. Some relationships deepen, others naturally loosen, and some may quietly dissolve. This isn't loss in the traditional sense. It's alignment. Connection doesn't disappear when expansion occurs. It becomes less driven by fear and more supported by mutual stability, where presence is chosen rather than needed for survival. Consider someone who has spent years being agreeable, attentive, and emotionally available, often without realizing how much effort that required. They were known as easy to talk to, supportive, always understanding. Then, slowly, something shifted. They stopped automatically agreeing, stopped smoothing over tension, stopped offering emotional energy on demand. Almost immediately, they felt strange in their own skin. Conversations felt heavier. Silence felt louder. They wondered if they had become distant or difficult. At first, the discomfort seemed like a problem, but over time, they noticed something important. The unease didn't come from withdrawing. It came from no longer betraying their internal signals. For the first time, they were listening to their body instead of overriding it to maintain harmony. What felt awkward wasn't coldness, but honesty without a script. They began to see that the old comfort came from self-abandonment disguised as kindness. Without that habit, the system felt unfamiliar, but also steadier. The strangeness wasn't a loss of self. It was the absence of a role they had outgrown. And in that absence, a quieter, more grounded way of relating slowly began to take shape. This stage doesn't ask you to do more. It asks you to stop interfering. There is no need to explain yourself excessively, to translate every internal shift into words others can understand. Over-explaining often pulls you back into old patterns of self-justification. You also don't need to correct yourself when your responses feel quieter, slower, or different than before. Let them be incomplete. Let them be simple. And above all, don't blame yourself for the discomfort. Guilt has a way of reactivating the very behaviors you're trying to move beyond. Instead, remain where you are. Stay with the unfamiliar sensations, without rushing to resolve them. Notice how your body responds when you don't force engagement, when you don't push enthusiasm, when you don't override your internal signals for the sake of smoothness. You may discover moments of tension at first, but also moments of unexpected relief. This is not withdrawal, it's observation. By staying present without judgment, you allow your system to show you what stability feels like when it isn't manufactured. Permanence here is not stagnation. It's how integration begins. There is a quiet paradox at the center of this experience. The more you try to return to who you were, the more tension you feel. Each attempt to recreate old reactions, old enthusiasm, or old ways of connecting only sharpens a sense of misalignment. What once felt natural now feels forced, and that effort registers as discomfort rather than relief. The body resists, not because something is wrong, but because it knows the old shape no longer fits. Yet, when you stop trying to fix or reverse the change, something else begins to happen. By remaining with the uncertainty instead of fighting it, clarity slowly starts to form on its own. Not all at once, and not in the form of answers, but as a growing sense of internal coherence. You begin to trust what feels steady rather than what feels familiar. Expansion doesn't require action or decisions in this phase. It requires tolerance for not knowing who you are becoming yet. This patience creates space for understanding to emerge naturally. When effort drops away, the system reorganizes itself. What feels like stagnation is often the very condition that allows something new to take shape. At this point, it becomes important to correct a misunderstanding about who you are becoming. You did not turn into a difficult person. You didn't lose your capacity to care, connect, or empathize. What changed is your availability for relationships that require you to abandon yourself in order to stay close. You are no longer willing to override your internal signals just to maintain access, harmony, or approval. This shift can be misread by others, and sometimes even by you, as coldness or rigidity. But it is an emotional withdrawal. It is adhesive. You're not rejecting connection. You're rejecting the conditions under which connection used to happen. The difference is subtle, but profound. This is not about being better than anyone else or rising above human needs. It's about attachment maturing instead of clinging, performing, or over-functioning to feel secure. Your system is learning to relate from stability. Bonds that survive this change are not built on fear of loss, but on mutual presence. What looks like distance is often the space required for healthier connection to exist. Feeling different is not the end of who you were. It is the beginning of who you can now sustain without disappearing inside expectations, roles, or emotional demands that no longer fit. What is falling away was not your essence, but the effort it once took to remain recognizable to everyone else. What remains is quieter, less performative, and more real. And because it doesn't announce itself loudly, it can feel uncertain at first. This phase doesn't offer conclusions or clear identities. It offers space. Space to exist without explanation. Space to respond rather than react. Space to notice that you no longer need to betray yourself to stay connected. There is no promise here of constant peace or immediate clarity. Only the recognition that something truer is forming beneath the silence. Nothing needs to be rushed. Nothing needs to be proven. Let the quiet do its work. Let the unfamiliar settle. And trust that what is emerging does not require urgency to be valid. If this resonated with you, support this space by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the most meaningful shifts don't need answers, they just need to be Witness. Te